So today we are finishing up this series called Miracles, where over really the past month we've been asking this question of ours. We've been asking, what is it going to take for us, for me, for you? What is it going to take for us this year to become more aware of and more dependent on the miracles of God? Because I think it's true. We all want to believe that God still does miracles. We all want to believe that God will still do miracles in our lives, just like he did in Bible times. But what oftentimes happens is our cynical, practical, skeptical side derails that hope in our lives, right? We become skeptical of God doing the things that he did in the Bible. And so we've been exploring these insane, eye-opening, mind-blowing miracles. Not illusions, but miracles of Jesus while here on planet Earth. And the hope is that we begin to discover what can happen when our limitations of life collide with the power of God. And I can't think of a better way to end this series than to see Jesus do what he does best. Jesus does more than anything else with the full power of God behind him. He is able to bring the dead back to life. I've told this story a couple times. Maybe some of you guys have already heard this story, but I think it's so powerful and it happened to me, so I enjoy the relatability it has. About 4 years ago, I was working and I get a call from Michael Weir. And Michael Weir used to go to our church, and I got permission to use this story. But Michael calls me up and he says, Pastor Steve, he says, I've got some bad news for you. And he's just freaking out. And he's panicking. It sounds like he's almost crying. And I say, what's going on, Michael? And he says, Paul has died. And I said, what? And he said, Paul, Paul from church has died. Now, you need to understand, the Paul he's talking about is Paul Curry, who is one of our elders here at our church, and he is alive today. He's back in the back there. He's alive. But 4 years ago, I get this call from Michael, and he says, Paul is dead. I'm like, what are you talking about? Are you sure? Because I haven't heard anything. And he says, I'm pretty sure that he's dead. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Well, they live in the same apartment complex in Villa Park, and he ran into someone, and he said, hey, your friend just died of a heart attack. And I'm like, are you sure it's Paul? And Michael says, yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Paul. And so I'm freaking out by this time, right? And my heart is beating faster and faster. If you've ever received a phone call from someone that tells you someone that you know or someone that you've loved has passed away, you know that feeling inside of you. And so I'm just freaking out, and I say, thank you for telling me. And so I hang up the phone. I call my wife, Amy Jo, and says, hey, Paul has died, Paul from church. And so I'm just freaking out. I call a couple of our leaders, and I didn't know who else to contact because no one else knew about this. And I didn't know any of his family. I didn't know how to contact them. And there was a part of me that wasn't sure that Michael got it right. And so I'm wondering, and I'm freaking, and there's about 45 minutes where I believe Paul is dead. And I know nothing else. I'm like, well, he works at Moody Bible downtown Chicago, so I'll call them. I don't know what that conversation is going to be, but I'll call them just to see if they've heard any news. And so I call them up, and again, on the phone, I have no idea how I'm really going to say this, but the receptionist answers the phone, and he says, this is Moody. How can I help you? And I said, I know this is going to seem strange, but I'm a pastor. My name is Steve Baker. I'm a pastor of a church where Paul Curry, who works at Moody, I've been told by another member of our church that he has died. And I just want to see if that's true or not. And like clockwork, he just pauses. Like there is a dead pause, at which for me, like I start to panic even more because I'm thinking this guy is trying to tell me that Paul has died. He doesn't know how to do it. And so he's just paused, right? And that pause seemed like 5 minutes, but it was only a couple seconds. And then he says, what now? And I said, my name is Steve Baker. I'm a pastor of a church. And one of the people who go to my church has told me that Paul, another person who works at Moody, has died of a heart attack. And he says, let me put you on hold. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Like now I think Paul is really dead. It must be true that Paul is dead, because why else would he put me on hold, right? He's probably calling someone in and saying, this guy is asking for Paul and he's dead and we don't know how to break it to him. And so again, they put me on hold what seems like 5 minutes, probably only a minute. And then all of a sudden I hear this. Hello, this is Paul. And I'm like, Paul, are you alive? You know, type of thing. And he says, yeah, this is Paul. And I said, Paul, this is Steve from church. And you're live. And he's like, yeah, I'm alive. And I'm like, Michael from church, he just called me and said, you died of a heart attack. And Paul's like, no, I'm alive. And I'm like, okay, are you sure? You know? And he said, yes. And I couldn't help it. I just started to cry. Like for about 45 minutes, I thought my friend Paul had died. And now he's alive. Like some would say, that is a miracle, right? Actually just turned out to be another guy who Michael knew, who ended up dying, and his name was Paul as well. But I thought it was a miracle, right? Paul was dead and now he's alive. Maybe not so much a miracle, right? Maybe just a miscommunication. But the story that we're going to look at today, in Mark chapter 5, there was actually someone who came back from the dead. It's in Mark chapter 5. Now, let me just set the stage for what we're about to read here, this incredible story. Just right before this story that we're going to read about, Jesus had crossed over to the bad side of the lake of his region, where there were demons and there was bad, evil stuff going on and pagans doing all kinds of bad stuff. And he comes over here and he discovers this guy who'd been demon-possessed, and he was insane. Everybody thought he was crazy. He was cutting himself. And Jesus does the impossible and heals this man of his demon possession. He casts the demons out of him, and he actually takes the demons and puts them inside of these pigs, right? Crazy story. And these pigs, actually, because now they're demon possessed, they run off this cliff and die. Like a bizarre story, a story that I'd love to see Hollywood portray. But this crazy story of Jesus healing this man. But again, we see the power of Jesus. And not only can he make blind people see and lame people walk, he can release people who had been demon possessed back to sanity. And that's where we pick up the story today in Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 1. It reads this way. Or verse 21. Jesus got into the boat again and went back to the other side of the lake, where a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. A large crowd, the Bible says. You have to understand, at this moment in time, Jesus was a rock star. Like everyone knew about Jesus and everyone wanted to be around Jesus. Everyone said, this is the guy who does the spectacular. He makes blind people see and lame people walk. I mean, he can do anything. And so people were traveling from all over just to get a glimpse of the spectacular by this guy named Jesus. So there's this huge crowd as he comes to the other side. Verse 22, then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. My little daughter is dying, he said. Please come and lay your hands on her, heal her so she can live. And every time I read this, as a parent of 3 kids, I can relate to the desperation and the urgency and the commitment of this guy named Jairus to get Jesus to his daughter. Like, I don't know what it was, but Jairus at some point had heard about Jesus. Had heard about all the miraculous things that Jesus could do. And all he knew is that his young little girl, whom he loved more than anything, was at home dying. And there was little hope for her. But he remembered this guy named Jesus, who people could say could do anything. And so he comes to Jesus desperately, urgently, falling on his feet and say, will you come and heal my dying daughter? This guy Jairus, he comes to the right guy. Because Jesus, this is what Jesus does. He brings to life what is dying or what is dead. And what he was asked to do with this little girl is what Jesus can actually do in your life and in my life. Wait a minute, Steve. I'm not dying. At least I don't think I'm dying. And we think that because most of us, when we think of someone dying, we think a physical death, right? The physical body just shuts down, right? You stop breathing, the blood stops circulating, your brain stops sending messages to the rest of your body. When we think of someone dying or us dying, we think physically. But what we need to understand before we get any further into this story is that death exists outside the physical. Physical is just one element of death. Death actually exists outside the physical. And what if I told you this morning that the most dangerous thing in your life is the worst thing that could ever happen in your life isn't that you would die physically? Like, I think for most of us humans, that is the one thing that we are scared of more than anything else, is dying physically. But what if I told you this morning that that is not the worst thing that could ever happen to you? What if I told you this morning that the worst thing that could ever happen to you is that you die, but yet you're still alive physically? What if I told you that that is worse than any physical pain or death that you would experience? Because the truth is, most of us, we have areas of our life, at least one area of our life, where if we were honest this morning, we feel like we're dying or that we are already dead. See, it's just not physically. We're functioning life as a human being. Right? We're walking, we're talking, we're working, but yet we feel dead inside. Maybe that's because a relationship has just ended. A special relationship. A marriage, a dating relationship, a friendship. And you're experiencing right now, as I'm talking, pain and anger and hurt. And you've come to recognize that this relationship is now over and it will never be the same. And you feel a little empty and lonely and dead inside. Maybe it's a relationship that ended a long, long time ago and you're still dealing with it. Or maybe it's a series of relationships that have ended over your life. And it seems like every one of those relationships, when it ended, it took a little bit of yourself. And you are never the same. Every one of those relationships took something from you, and now you feel numb relationally. Maybe it's the death of a dream for you. Maybe there's something that you have been working for and dreaming of and hoping for years. And you've come to accept and realize that it will never happen for you in your life. And it has robbed you now of things like joy and happiness, and there's no more passion anymore. You're just going through the motions of life. You're, for all intents and purposes, dead. Maybe it's something that happened to you in your past, or a series of events that has left you feeling dead inside. Whatever it is, it sucked the life right out of you, and you were never the same. You've never been able to recover. And you feel like you're just dead. No passion, no life. Maybe it's your faith. Maybe you've tried everything. Maybe you've forced yourself to read God's words. You come here on Sunday or you try to pray to God, but you just don't feel alive spiritually. You feel empty and you feel void of all spiritual awareness and joy and happiness. See, death exists outside the physical. But make no mistake about it, this story, there is a physical death that's happening right in front of Jesus' eyes. And so Jesus says, yes, I'll help you. I'll come back to your home, Jairus, and I will heal your daughter. Now, along the way, as Jesus is walking to Jairus' house, there's a woman who'd been diseased for 12 years. And she fights through the crowds. Everyone's following Jesus. And she fights through the crowds. And she thinks to herself, if I can just touch his garment, just the edge of his garment, then he can heal me. That's how powerful he is. And so that's what she does. She fights through the crowds, touches the hem of his garment, and instantly Jesus feels the power leave him. And he turns around and says, hey, who touched me? And everyone turns around and says, "There's all these people are touching you. It's a huge crowd. Everyone's following you. What do you mean?" He says, "No, I felt power leave me." That's how powerful Jesus is. And all of a sudden he finds this woman and they start to have this dialogue and conversation, and she gets him up to speed. She says, "I'd hoped that you would heal me. I've been fighting with this disease for 12 years. And Jesus says, "You have been faithful. And because of your faith, I'm going to heal you now." And that's what Jesus does. He heals her right on the spot of her blood disease. And then look what happens. In verse 35, it says this: "While he was still speaking to her, messengers arrived from the home of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. They told him, 'Your daughter is dead. There's no use troubling the teacher now. It's over.' But Jesus overheard them and said to Jairus," he looked straight at Jairus and said, "Do not be afraid, just have faith." Do not be afraid, just have faith. I mean, Jesus takes on two heavyweights here: fear and faith. The two greatest factors, two most critical factors to whether you live life or you die. Because death exists outside the physical. Fear and death. Jesus says, do not be afraid. See, Jesus understands that Jairus, as a father, his worst fears come into reality. His little girl is dying, is dead. I'm a father of 3, and I can't imagine if I was ever told that one of my kids had died. Some of you in this room, you probably have experienced that, and I can't imagine that. Like my son Carson, he's about to go to college next fall in about 7 months. I can't imagine that. I can't imagine losing my son to Tennessee, right? And that scares the heck out of me. I can't imagine what Jairus is going through here, that his little girl, his darling girl has died. And Jesus says, do not be afraid. Why? Because Jesus understands that fear cheats you from living life. Fear cheats you and I from living life. I promise, whatever area of your life where you feel like you're dying or you feel dead with no passion, no life, I promise there is an element of fear that is present. Because more than anything else, fear sucks the life right out of you. See, listen, the moment you begin to give power to fear in your life is the moment you begin to no longer live. Fear is so powerful in your life. And I don't know what that fear is in your life right now that is preventing you from really living. Maybe it's a fear of taking a step that is risky and you know you need to take it, but you are not taking that step because of fear. Maybe it's fear to open up and become vulnerable again to someone, to another person, and give your heart to them because of all the times people have let you down. Maybe it's fear that you have, that you're moving on from your past. You just cannot move on from it. Maybe it's fear that you are open and honest to another person about what you're struggling with, what you're dealing with in your life. Maybe it's a fear of failing or becoming a failure, or fear of losing something or someone. Too many of us live in fear. Actually, that's not right. Too many of us die in fear. And we let this thing called fear prevent us from truly living. And my hope and my prayer is that today that we start to deal with those fears, that we look fear in the eye and we say, you no longer have power over me. Well, how do I do that, Steve? I've been having this fear in my life for years. I've been dealing with this. I've been trying to fight this fear. And every time I come back and it has power over me, how do I overcome my fears? Jesus tells us, he says, don't be afraid, Jairus. Then he says, just have faith. You see, fear prevents you from living life. It steals, it cheats you from living life. Faith, on the other hand, is the catalyst to living life. Faith is what will allow you to live. When you have faith, you have hope. When you have faith, you have strength to get you through whatever you're going through. When you have faith, you have guidance for your life. When you have faith, you have purpose and meaning. When you have faith, you have an anchor in the midst of your storms. And the problem is, so many of us, like myself, we lose faith. And so we go looking for it. And we think this is what's going to help us overcome our fears. We think, you know what? If I was just more financially stable, if I just had more money or more things or more finances in my savings account, then I would feel more stable. And then I would be more happy and I would feel good about life. Maybe if this relationship just would work out or my marriage would get better and it would start giving me what I needed, then I could be happy again. Then I could feel the passion again. It would come back to me. If I just had a more rewarding job, right? My job right now just does not give me any purpose. I hate it. It just gives me a paycheck and that's it. If I just had a more rewarding job, then I would come alive. The problem is all of these things, they just always fall short of giving us the life that we so desire. Faith is the catalyst for living life. You want to be alive again? You want to feel alive again? You want to come back from the dead? Focus on your faith in God. Focus on your faith with Jesus Christ, because that's where you're going to find faith. Jesus says in John 10:10, he says, my purpose, Jesus, when he's talking, he says, my purpose here on planet Earth is to give people life. That's why I've come. And not just to give people life, but to give people full, abundant, complete life. See, what I think Jesus is doing here with Jairus is he's giving him an option. He says, okay, your little girl, you've been told that your little girl is now dead. You have two options. You can either let fear overcome the situation, or you can have faith in me. And that is the same choice that you and I have every single day. We either are going to live in fear or we're going to live by faith. But you can't have both. You can't have fear and faith. You have to choose one or the other. You either live in fear or you live by faith. And Jesus is saying to Jairus, and I think what he's saying is saying to me and to you is, choose one. You can't have both. You have to choose which one. Fear or faith. Jesus, he says, don't be afraid, Jairus. Just have faith. Then verse 37, it says, then Jesus stopped the crowd and wouldn't let anyone go with him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw much commotion and weeping and wailing. He went inside and asked, why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead, she's only asleep. Now, I don't know about you, but every time I read this and I hear this, I think, well, that's sort of insensitive of Jesus. Right? This girl has died. Of course there's weeping and wailing and grieving. That's what you do when someone you love dies, right? It's almost as if Jesus is clueless to what's going on, what's happened here. I mean, understand though that while it may seem that way, Jesus is not being unsympathetic. That's not what's happening here. It's not even that Jesus is denying that this girl has actually died. No, what Jesus is actually saying here is, listen, I understand that this girl has died, but it's only temporary. See, death means nothing to me. That's what Jesus is saying here. He's saying, hey, with me, with Jesus, death is never final. That's what you and I need to hear. That death is no longer final in our lives. Not for this little girl, not for a guy named Lazarus who actually Jesus raised from the grave, not for Jesus himself who hung on a cross and died for you and for me, but yet 3 days later came back from the dead. With Jesus, death is never final. And some of you are here today and you've given up on your situation. You just have. And you feel like this is just one area of my life where I'm not going to be happy. I'm not going to have passion for it. You've convinced yourself that it's over. It's finished. There is no way to go back and there is no way to come back from it. Now, you may feel dead right now in an area of your life, but understand death has never and will never have power over Jesus. He can bring back to life whatever is inside of you that is dying or that is dead. He can bring the passion back to your life. He can bring the purpose back. He can bring the hope back. He can bring the joy back. He says, she's only asleep, Jesus says. Verse 40, the crowd laughed at him. But he made them all leave. He said, get out of here. And he took the girl's father and mother and his 3 disciples into the room where the girl was lying, holding her hand. This girl's dead. He said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, get up. And the girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. They were all, everyone who saw this, were so overjoyed and totally amazed. I mean, again, incredible, mind-blowing that Jesus brings someone back from the grave. This little girl, she was dead. It was over. The death certificate was being filled out as we speak. Her life, and it was short, but it was over. There was no debating it. But yet Jesus changes all of this with 2 words. He looks at this girl. He's holding her hand. He's touching her. And he says, Talitha cum. In other words, girl, it's time to breathe again. It's time to live again. Talitha cum. And I think today, Jesus, for many of us in this room, he wants to hold our hand. He says, come with me. And he wants to look at your situation, whatever that is. And he wants to say to you, Talitha cum. It's time to breathe again. It's time to live again. It's time to bring the passion back and the fire and the purpose and the meaning and the hope. Jesus comes to you and he says, I know you've been hurt relationally. I know people have disappointed you and turned their backs on you. I know that maybe it's your spouse, or maybe you're divorced, or maybe you've lost a relationship, or maybe it's family members. And I know relationally you are probably feeling very numb right now. But Talitha cum, it's time to breathe again. Jesus comes to some of you this morning. He says, listen, I know you've experienced some setbacks in your life. I know you've had many setbacks financially, setbacks in your relationships, setbacks in your careers and your hopes and your dreams, but I'm here to bring all of that back today. Jesus says to you, Talitha cum, it's time to dream again. Jesus looks at some of you and he says, listen, I know you are imprisoned right now. I know that some of you feel so in bondage to something. Maybe that's your depression or anxiety or low self-esteem or some sin pattern or habit that has become destructive or some addiction in your life. And Jesus looks at you this morning and he says, Talitha cum, it's time to break those chains and experience life and freedom again. Let Jesus do for you today what Jesus did for this little girl. Bring her back from the grave. Bring her back from the dead. Talitha cum. But the story doesn't end there. It's actually a very perplexing, weird, bizarre twist to this miracle. But I think it's worth noting. Verse 43, Jesus gave them strict orders. Listen, he had just healed this girl, brought her back from the dead, and Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened. And then he told them to give her something to eat. Jesus says, I know I just brought this girl back from the grave, but I don't want you to tell anyone. Mark says he gave them strict orders. Like, are you kidding me, Jesus? You just brought a dead person back from the grave. This does not happen. I am going to tell everyone I see. Are you kidding me? I mean, this seems to go against everything that Jesus was all about sharing who he was and his power to everyone they knew. In fact, the story that I told about where Jesus heals this demon-possessed man, Jesus looks at him and says, hey, I need you to go tell everyone on your side who did this and what I'm all about. And now he's saying, don't tell anyone. What's the deal? What is going on? See, as I mentioned before, people were flocking to Jesus. They were coming from all over, hoping that Jesus would do for them what Jesus has done for others. And I think Jesus was fully aware that the hype of this miracle, bringing someone back from the dead, could possibly mislead people and send mixed messages. What do you mean, Steve, by that? See, because with Jesus, these miracles were never the point. They were never the point. All these miracles that we're studying, all these miracles that we find in the Bible, they were never the point. The point was to bring people to the point, which was to reveal who Jesus really was, that he was indeed the Son of God, that he was indeed God in the flesh. And I think the message here, and it's a tough one for some of us to hear, but that we are to follow Jesus for who he is, not for what he can do for you. See, I think so many times, especially in American churches and Christianity in America, that pastors will stand up here and say, this is what Jesus can do for you. And I've been up here every week, especially during this miracle series, and say, this is what Jesus can do for you. And so people come to Jesus because of what he can do for them, instead of trusting in Jesus, following Jesus because of who he is. Yes, Jesus can, and he will do the impossible in your life. He will open your eyes to all the blind spots that you have. He will provide the best for you in your life, just like he does when he turns the water into wine and brings the good wine for the wedding. He will heal all of your sicknesses, physically, mentally, spiritually, relationally. And he will do all those things in your life, and he can do all those things in your life. But there is a purpose bigger than just helping you out. It's to reveal to you, to bring you to who Jesus really is, that he is truly the Son of God, that he is truly God in the flesh. If you only follow Jesus because of what he can do for you, sooner or later your faith becomes jaded and it will be filled with disappointment. But I promise you, if you follow Jesus simply for who he is and put your faith and trust in him, there's life waiting for you. Talitha kum. It's what happens when the limitations of life collide with the power of God. Miracles still happen. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for the power that you have revealed to us over and over again. Not just in the Bible, but in our own lives. God, each of us here, we have seen you work, your power in our lives and the lives of others. But yet we're still a little skeptical that it can actually happen to us. God, I pray today that whatever is dying inside each and every one of us, whatever death we are experiencing inside of our souls and our hearts and our minds, God, that you would bring us back to life, that you would bring the passion, that you would bring the fire, that you would bring the purpose and meaning and hope back to this area of our lives, God. That's what you do. You bring to life what is dead or what is dying. And God, we pray today that you would do this, that you would do the impossible in our lives, so that when we leave here today, we're a new person. We stand, Talitha kum, and that we rise up and we breathe again. And we have passion and joy and happiness again. God, thank you for your son Jesus, who your power was revealed through in clear, distinctive ways. God, and that's the Jesus we want to follow. Not because of what you do for us, but because of who you are. And that's why we want to follow you. That's why we place our faith and trust in you. God, we love you. We thank you. Be with us over the next few moments and work in us. Speak to us right where we're at. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.